Okay, can everybody hear me? If you can hear me, um, give me a thumbs up or a like or something that lets you know. Give me some comments. Yeah, I know it's right at 7, so I'll give people a couple minutes to join in. How's the latency and the sound if you're listening? Does it sound good? Does it sound terrible? I will check the sound on my other computer as well. Um, okay, on my other computer it sounds pretty good. Um, okay, let's see what we've got going on here. Um, Thank you for joining me for the first live stream. Ask Me Anything. Um, I'm excited. We got a lot of really good, interesting questions. I'm gonna kind of go through them in the order that I received them, and hopefully that will work well for everybody. And then if you have questions as the live stream's going on, feel free to ask them. If you want me to clarify my answer to a previous question, again, feel free, and I'm happy to do that. So the first question is an interesting question. It's from Amy, and she asks, do you feel a dog's whiskers play a part in its scenting ability or success? And it's a very much an ethology question, which I love. I love thinking about that kind of stuff. And the first thing I'll say is that animals' whiskers play a very important role in their ability to interact with the world in general. And if you've done any nose work for any amount of time, I'm sure you're aware that um, when a dog is in odor or using its nose, that oftentimes that dog bumps into things or is constantly running into something, and I think they turn their eyes off when they're using their nose. So a dog having whiskers can allow them to navigate their environment because the whiskers touch and they protect their eyes, right? So they touch the whiskers and they know to move their head away. So I think for dogs that are really driven, high drive, I think they're blind, stronger role because they're a tactile way of feeling your way in around environment. I don't think it affects the dog's actual scenting ability. I don't think it makes them smell better, like dogs with longer whiskers would smell better. I don't think that's how it works. But it's an interesting question, and I bet the role of the whiskers in hunting it's probably more than what we think it is. So it's a very interesting question. Um, so the next question is from Lindia. Another very similar question that I get a lot. When should I call alert? I always seem to wait until my dog's nose is on source and not moving, but I'm often told that I should have called it sooner, right? So I'll try to answer this question a slightly different way than I've answered this same question in the past. What I'll say is that you should call alert in different ways in different situations. So when I'm at a class and I see someone taking their time to call alert, the class is not the time to take your time. The class is the time to test to see how good you can read your dog. So if you think your dog is alerting, call it. If you're wrong, that's what I'm there for, right? That's what you're paying me for. At a trial, when someone takes too long to call alert, I can understand that. Like, yeah, okay, you're nervous and all the things that are going on wrong. But when you do that in class, I'm going to come down on you hard. Why are you taking so long? Call it quickly in class. So when you're being told that you should have called it sooner, usually that's what I mean. It's in a particular situation, your goal should be to call it sooner. In another situation, maybe you take your time and you do it as you play it safe, maybe in a trial. Now, another thing that I should say is if if I see someone at a trial, right, and this is a very specific situation. So the dog finds odor and they take a while to call alert, right? Maybe they even leave and come back. You know, a lot of people will sometimes say you should have called it sooner. And what they mean, what they're really trying to communicate to you is your dog is better than you give them credit for. They're not actually saying you should have called it sooner, although you probably should have. They're just trying to give you encouragement, like your dog's better than you give them credit for. Now, sometimes, take another situation. You're in a trial, your dog hits the odor and leaves, and you don't call it. Let's say you don't call it at all. You fall somewhere else or something. When your dog is in an environment, and that environment is somewhat distracting, your dog hits an object stronger than anywhere else, even if it's worse than anything you've ever seen in class, but it's the strongest thing you've seen there, that's the best your dog's going to give you. So when they say you should have called it sooner, what they're saying is, I'm not saying this is your dog's strongest alert ever, but it was the strongest alert in that environment. So what you're looking for is a change in the dog's behavior. So if your dog is working a search area a particular way and they change that behavior, you need to pay attention to that. I'm going to answer a question here on Patreon. Someone's having trouble seeing it. And because they say they can't see or hear me, maybe it's because I can't just tell them what to do, so I have to type out the answer. Okay, so continuing to my next question. A question from Carol. This is a big question, so we'll see just how much I can answer it, and if there's a particular direction, because it's such a big question, if someone wants me to go in a particular direction, make sure you say so, so that I can definitely answer that, hopefully. So the question is, how do I go from NW1 to NW2? Off-leash interiors with multiple hides, time management, follow pattern, but if the dog wants to go back to found odor, leash, or is there a better strategy? This is from Carol. So a couple things I should say. There's, whenever you're looking at a particular trial level and preparing for that trial level, the first thing you want to ask is, what question definitely seems more hand focused. And so from the dog's perspective, you need to prepare for changes when you get to NW2. Oh, come on. Okay, am I back? I don't know what happened to my internet there. It seemed to be fairly stable for a while. At NW2 is the transition phase from 1 to 3. And so what happens is most handlers go through a phase where they're experimenting with handling in a more patterned way. And they often go through a phase where they completely overhandle. And I think that's a phase that people almost need to go through. I don't think you can avoid it. I think you need to overhandle in order to learn what overhandling means and how to handle the appropriate amount. So the answer to your question about what to do when a dog goes back to a hide, I'll tell you what I do with my dogs at any level if there's multiple hides. What I do is, if I'm off leash in an environment, if my dog goes back to a hide they've already found, I first ask myself, are they going back because I brought them back, or are they going back when I was trying to go somewhere else and they're heading back on their own? If they're heading back on their own, I clip them back on leash. I don't want to have that fight in a trial. So that's not my goal that trial day. If I brought them back, I pay them and move on. Right? Now, if they got back even because they wanted to go back and they kind of cheated me, then I will still pay them at source and clip the leash on and move on. I think if the dog fights you to go to odor source, they should always get a reward. That's my opinion on that. Let's see. The other thing is that going off leash isn't always the best option. I just did a trial in Gunnison where I think I would have titled if I had kept her on leash. Now, I tend to be the kind of trainer that says if you have the opportunity to go off leash, you should. And I agree with that, but there are very specific situations where a leash helps. And so just to give you an idea of what that situation was, it was an interior, and it was a weirdly shaped room. It was a museum. This was in Gunnison, Colorado. Some of you may have been there. And what happened was when you come in the door, there was a room off to the left. And so this room off to the left had a partition in it. So it was divided into 2 sub-rooms, and you could get around the partition this way, or you could go around the partition this way. So my dog takes off this way in odor, and she goes around the partition, and I think, oh, I'm not going to follow her through because I don't want to push her through that small gap. So I went around, and that was a bad choice because we ended up face to face, and my dog was in odor, and she alerted, and I said, I don't know if she's in odor or not because I came from this side to that side, and I ended up calling a fringe alert. If I had been on leash, as she'd go around that partition, I would have had to follow her because I wouldn't have dropped my leash. So that's a situation where it's kind of unlucky what happened. And even when you're off leash, in my opinion, you should handle as if you're on leash. I think that in general, that's a good strategy. So if any of you have more questions about NW2 and how to prepare for it, feel free to comment that in the comments. I just got a question a moment ago. So let me see what it says. Okay, so if you're always calling quick alerts in training, isn't there a possibility you won't be able to call slower in alerts in trial? That's a good question. Thank you, Irv. I think that the initial bias of a handler to call alerts way too slowly, I'm trying to temper that. So I think that if you call alerts too quickly, you'll start calling false alerts, and that will naturally slow you down. So I'm only worried about speeding you up. Maybe if you called alerts super quick in training all the time, you might call it too quickly in a trial, but I think you'll only do that once or twice. And so in general, I think the pendulum swings way too far on the slow side, so I'm just trying to swing it too far on the quick side and then hoping that we achieve the balance point. But that said, nothing is an absolute. So if I think you should, on average, you should call it quicker. But for very specific situations, you should try to call it slower, I would say, for practice, if nothing else. Okay. To answer about the multiple hides thing, there is a better strategy about how to handle multiple hides without putting the dog back on leash. But I only teach it to people who have built super solid odor obedience, as in it is nearly impossible for them to get the dog to leave an odor without dragging them away. If you get to that point, I'll teach you the super secret method of doing multiple hides. Irv knows this method, and a few of my students locally know this method, but I don't really teach it to most people. Because I think it comes with severe risks if you abuse it. So yeah, just a teaser. Eventually, if any, of training, competing with a dog in multiple scent sports. For example, nose work, barn hunt, tracking, etc. This is a really good question. We have the handler scent discrimination handout on Patreon if you're interested in our thoughts in specifically AKC handler scent discrimination. And here's what I think. When you train a dog in handler scent discrimination or in barn hunt, you're training them on a fourth odor, right? So we've got birch, anise, clove, and rats, or handler scent. So you have to answer a couple questions. The first question you have to answer is, what do I do if my dog finds a rat in a nosework search? How am I going to respond? My dog alerts on the rat, and I call alert and it's a false alert. Let's say it's training or a trial, it doesn't matter. Should my dog be punished right? Should my dog be rewarded, right? We've added now a layer of complexity and confusion potentially for our dogs and for us. So that to me is the risk. So if you're going to participate in multiple sense sports, you have to clearly define the context difference. So for example, in barn hunt, you use a different equipment, use a different search command. There's a good context difference in that it's a very specific environment. So you got hay bales, right? And specific fencing, and people interact a certain way. So I think they really understand when they're doing barn hunt and when they're doing nose work. But now what do we do if we want to take a nose work search, but we want to do it in a place that has hay? Now you're at a little bit of a dilemma, and hopefully the special nose work collar they wear, the special treats they get for nose work, hopefully you've kept it so different, maybe even the shoes you're wearing, all as many differences as possible, so the dog knows what their job is. But I would hope, one of the things that we've done since the inception of nose work is that you never put odor on agility equipment, and I would hope that with the creation of these other sports, and I want people to be able to play in multiple dog sports. So I would hope that people would choose against doing exteriors that have hay in them when they have a choice, right? So if were using a barn for a nose work trial, I would hope that the COs and judges that are setting the hides would avoid using the hay areas. Now tracking, on the other hand, is a little different. Tracking is very contextually different. They're wearing a harness. Your body language is different. The long line handling is different. And I actually think that having a dog that tracks, well, first thing that should be noticed is that when dogs track naturally, right? So I'm not training the dog to do something new. All I'm doing is teaching the dog to do what they already do on command. I think a dog that is aware of tracks is better at nose work. If you think about it, your dog 40 out of 40 dogs, and if that dog can come into the room and say, look, there's 40 tracks going straight to the hide, they can use that as a clue. That's an advantage. What you don't want is a dog who relies on tracks, who needs a track to find the hide. And then if the tracks go to a false alert, then the dog falses, right? So if you have a tracking dog or a dog who naturally tracks, even if you haven't trained it, I would recommend intentionally laying distraction tracks through your search environments to throw the dog off. Because your dog may well have learned to track you to where you set the hide. So make sure you zigzag all through that environment, right? Leave and come back, and leave and come back. Have other people walk through the search environment if your dog has that aptitude, so they don't become reliant on it. They say it's a clue, but it's not the whole picture. So handler scent discrimination in obedience, when it's always a dumbbell, right? Something like that, I'm totally okay with. What I'm not okay with is that the AKC does the first level of handler discrimination in ORT boxes. To me, ORT boxes are like sacred, as sacred as you can get in nose work. This is something that I only use for nose work. I don't want the dog to learn any other behaviors on an ORT box, especially considering how much I work to train the dogs to ignore my scent on boxes. I wouldn't want to undermine that. So I hope that makes sense. If you compete in multiple scent sports, comment on this post and tell us, do you ever notice them being confused? Do they do really well? What context differences do you use to make sure the dog knows what their job is? Okay, let's see. Let's look at another one. Okay, so this is from Caroline. She says, another question whenever either of you have time. She's been wondering about buried hides. Good, bad, or ugly? Just another container or inaccessible hide? What about residual odor? Is that what it is? Are we doing any harm working these types of hides? I've thought a lot about buried hides since AKC. I mean, before AKC came up with buried hides, we did buried hides all the time in training. Not all the time, but as regularly as we did maybe submerged hides. And maybe sometime in the future, an organization will have a submerged hide class, right? And people will all freak out and start training hides underwater. The problem with a buried hide is the problem with any inaccessible hide. Inaccessible hides teach a dog two things. One, is that you don't have to get to source because I'm going to reward you away from source. And two, if you try to get to source, it teaches them to scratch, right? Which is both of those. It's a lose-lose situation. So with buried hides, you're not absolved of that. Any container search is inaccessible, and that's a problem. The extra problem of that, like my normal workaround for inaccessible hides, is that if it's in a box, I open the box, let the dog get to source, reward him. If it's in a cabinet, I open the cabinet, let the dog get to source, reward him. If it's buried, I suppose I could unbury it, but that's a lot of work, and I wouldn't want my dog to start learning from me that it's okay to dig up the hide. I think the dog understands there's a difference between opening a cabinet door and digging at odor, right? That's something that I think dogs can learn allomimetically. In fact, I think they do. My aunt in Florida, I went and they didn't know I was a dog trainer, and so they were asking me all their dog questions. I'm sure you guys all know what that's like with family on the holidays and stuff. And they were like, my dog is digging up the garden. It's driving us crazy. We don't know why they're doing it. They started out of nowhere. I was like, well, have you been digging in the garden recently? And like, oh yeah, we just put in a sprinkler system and the dog was watching us dig that up. And it's like, well, look, the dog is following your direction. You're digging and now the dog's digging. So we know that dogs can learn digging allomimetically. So I wouldn't want to dig up a buried hide. So for that reason, I would not do it very often if I could avoid it. But giving your dog exposure to that odor picture is never a bad thing. I think since AKC has a buried hide class, now I would only do buried hides with AKC odor. So that strength of odor is super valuable. I think it makes it powerful enough that I don't think the dog thinks of it as residual odor. I don't think when a dog digs up an animal underground that they think it's a residual odor. They think it's real odor. So I think the dog can learn the difference between residual buried and regular buried, but I don't know how to teach that, and I wouldn't even attempt to teach that yet. So I don't think we're harming the dog by doing it. I think you harm the dog whenever you do too many inaccessible hides. And buried's not special in this way. It's the same as any other inaccessible hide. And the dogs that I've sent to AKC trials to compete in, I've never actually competed in AKC yet. The dogs I've sent there have had little to no exposure to buried and have had no problem. So I don't think the dogs think of it as any special. So that's my answer to that. Okay, let me look for some new questions. If you have questions, make sure that you push them on here. I'm going to go for at least an hour. So if I run out of questions, then I'll end there. So let's see. So this is from Elisa. I've volunteered at trials where I was the gate steward, and I've watched people yank their dog's nose off the ground while they are waiting to go to a search area. Is there a benefit to not allowing your dog to sniff before or after a search while waiting to go into a search? And if so, what are they? That's an interesting question. I would say that having a dog that's able to cope with a variety of environments is always a good thing. So my dog should be able to wait, even if that's not what I'm normally going to do with them. They should be flexible enough that when I ask them to wait, they can wait. They should be able to go in with a lot of information or a little information. I used to tell my students, hold your dog at the start line as long as possible to let them sniff the environment, right? Because that's all free time that it's off the clock. I know I've seen what you're talking about too, where the dog starts to sniff and they yank the dog's nose off the ground. The people who do that and the dogs who get that done to them, they're almost always, what's the way to say this? They're bland dogs. They're boring. They're not interested in hunting. The handlers are not interested in handling them properly. And I think this is what's happened is the handler has low expectation of the dog. They assume the dog will fail, so they start by punishing the dog. And the solution is to teach a dog to hunt with drive, right? So preparing. It's letting the dog see you hide things. It's building that dog's natural hunt drive in a variety of environments. And you really shouldn't punish the dog until you know the dog wants to hunt. Really, you shouldn't punish the dog at all, right? But at least if you're going to do this, know that your dog is driven, right? I think sometimes I'm in a staging area, and the search area is a certain distance away, and my dog is searching that staging area. I'm sure many of you have experienced that. The dog searching in the staging area. I think that can be an advantage and a disadvantage. I think your dog has a limited amount of energy, and I don't want them to waste it. So one thing I do with my dogs is I teach them not to search until the nose work collar comes on. So if we're in a staging area, I don't put it on yet. I don't put it on until I'm basically on the last leg of my journey to the start line, somewhere in there. But if I put my search collar on and then I have 2 or 3 staging areas and my dog's searching each one, by the time I get to the search area, my dog might be tired. Some of you have very, very exuberant dogs that never get tired, which is great, but some of us don't, right? Some of us have dogs that we have to manage their energy level. That said, one of the NW3s that we titled in, I titled in with Lumi, they stage us for the exterior in a classroom, which is kind of unique. I hadn't staged in a classroom to go, and the doorway exiting the classroom was the threshold for the exterior, which was kind of cool. So they left me in there, and there was no gate steward in there, and they just left me and said, wait here until someone gets you. And so I did the whole room blank. It was the first search of the day. I don't run warm-up boxes. I think that blank search was the best thing I could have done. She did a beautiful detailed pattern search of that whole room, exactly what you'd expect in a blank room. And then, like, right by the time we finished the blank search, they came to get us. We went to exteriors, and there was a threshold right there, and bam, she nailed it. In fact, that video is on YouTube. You can find it. It's the one where I come off the start line, and she's right there, and she flings her head up. It's a pavement area with some grass. There's 2 hides, one on the doorstop and one on the bench. So I think there are pros and cons to both letting the dog sniff and not letting the dog sniff. I think dogs should be able to be restrained without losing drive, but I think you build that by building drive, not by restraining the dog. I definitely don't think there's really a place in nose work for yanking the dog, ever. I mean, I guess if your dog's acting aggressively towards a judge, then yank all you want, I suppose. But not for them using their nose. I don't think that has a place. But restraining a dog and expecting a dog to sit patiently, there might be a place. I wrote another post where I have Irv's national searches, and I said he missed 2 hides. And so he's wondering, for a very odor-obedient dog who is very engaged in the space, can have simple lapses. I'm asking because I always view missed hides. And you'll appreciate this, Irv, because I know you did genetics. It's like asking, is a person's hide ever a result of the environment, or is it only genetics? And of course the answer is, like, you cannot disentangle genetics and environment. It's just impossible. You can't disentangle those 2 things. So is it ever the dog's fault? Is it ever the handler's fault? Is it ever not both of their faults? I think in the end, what we're talking about is how much the blame falls on each party. And it's the dog, the handler, and the environment. All 3 of those come into play. Is the environment ever designed in such a way that a dog might miss a hide? Yeah, absolutely. But maybe with a good dog and a good handler, they can overcome the environment. Maybe with a good environment and a good dog, those both together can overcome a bad handler. Maybe a good environment and a good handler can overcome a badly trained dog, right? I think in general, a good handler and a good handler will overcome the environment. But even the best dog and the best handler will like the best handler in the world will have a lapse of judgment, right? Same with the best dog in the world. They'll have a lapse where, you know, maybe they're tired, maybe a leaf blows while they were working odor and they got distracted for a moment, you know? Yeah, of course that can happen. You cannot avoid the fact that luck plays a role in nose work. And you gotta hate it that luck plays that role, but it's there. And all the training you do is to help reduce the effect that luck has on your search. Hopefully, if you train really well, the luck's effect on your searches is negligible. And then if you do that well, then when your dog does make a mistake, you can basically say it had to be luck because me and my dog were doing it right, so it's just bad luck. But yes, I absolutely believe, and I've been in classes myself where I'm taking lessons from other people, and maybe it's not blind, but I always handle as if it's blind. So I get my dog into the area that they need to be in to get the hide, and my dog walks it. I'm like, I'm putting them away. The dog missed that. I handled perfectly, and even if I didn't handle perfectly, the dog should make up for that. So I don't think it's fair to punish a dog if you don't think it was somewhat the dog's fault. Punish, in this case, what are you doing, cat? In this case, punishment means putting the dog away in a search, right? Or even punishment could be allowing the dog to miss a hide. I would say that it's not fair. If it's never the dog's fault, then it's never appropriate to punish the dog. But if it might be the dog's fault a little bit, then punishment might really make sense to the dog. Okay, let me pull up another question. So, this person... And I know this is a controversial point, but I really do believe that setting single, paired, accessible hides are the best way to train every type of hide. I think dogs that can do single, paired, accessible hides really well, as in you can't pry them off of it, don't have converging problems. They don't, because they're not interested in sorting. They just go to one and find it, and they go to the other and find it. It's only dogs that have weak interest in one hide that have trouble sorting. Same with pooling. If a dog is really good at one single paired hide, which means that not the perfect situation, like the worst, the most difficult accessible paired hides, right? Bumper off the car, right? So if the dog's willing to rip the bumper off the car and you don't call alert, then you're just an idiot, right? So I really believe that. I don't believe dogs at them. I think it's the drive for one and driving to that's what hides. So that's a good question, and it's something I'm very passionate about. I think that in the nosework world, one of the biggest problems I see is people spend too much time training what they consider advanced problems and not nearly enough time laying down foundation, which is single, accessible, paired hides, right? Which hopefully we'll be starting her on soon, so you'll be able to see her being imprinted on odor. Oh, you're so upset. I know. Well, you're jumping around being crazy. Okay. So, another question from Irv. I'm getting to the end of my questions, so if you guys have more questions, make sure you post them. So, Irv says, one of the good consequences of training patterning is that when the dog exhibits an exceptional behavior by breaking the pattern, that signifies something significant, often being drawn to odor away from the pattern. However, in my experience, the pattern becomes more difficult to reestablish once it has been broken. It is something that should be explicitly, is that something that should be explicitly trained, reestablishing patterning after a break, or is that difficulty just a consequence of not training patterning enough, or something else? I think, and I say this in my classes, when there's multiple hides, that's when the handler steps in. So the dog follows their pattern, they break their pattern, they find a hide. Now, in order to leave the hide, because I train dogs not to leave, right? So it's the handler's responsibility to make the dog leave. So I train the dog that, or I train handlers that when you reward the dog, it is your job to take the dog back to the pattern where you left it and continue from there. This is a habit that has to build up. I don't expect my dog to do that. I suppose that a really, really well-trained dog could do that on their own, but I don't expect my dogs to do that. I do that. That is one of the things that's my job, right? Um, I think over time you get better at it. I think over time you also get better at becoming flexible. So maybe you don't resume the pattern exactly where you left, but because of the detour you took, maybe you pick up the pattern somewhere else depending on the shape and size of the search area. A common example of this is, so at the start line, the dog picks up an odor way at the other end. And your dog takes off, then you follow them because you know they're an odor, and they find that. Instead of going all the way back to the threshold and resuming the pattern, just start the pattern from the back and work the pattern from that way as if that was your new threshold, right? I think that's always a good easy example of how to be flexible. Okay, I'm going to let you go, but you can't knock anything over. So it's a matter of training yourself to be disciplined, that when the dog found that odor, you reward, and then you ask them to resume. And I would almost, you can make it fluid and organic, or you can just take the dog back to where they left the pattern and like start it like a brand new search. Give them a re-cue. Do what it takes to learn it. The goal is to make it invisible, fluid, organic, so that nobody even sees that you did that. It should almost look like it was the dog's decision to do that. In fact, for some of you who have been doing patterning long enough, you know that the line gets real blurry as to whether the dog is doing the pattern or whether I'm doing the pattern. And at the beginning, you think, I'm doing the pattern, I'm forcing the dog. That's what you think. But over time, you realize, I'm not doing anything. The dog's doing the pattern. And all I'm doing is staying out of their way. So that's the goal. And I think it should start that way. The dog does patterns. Patterns are not something handlers do, but it's very rare that I have a student that's able to understand that right at the beginning. Okay, let's see. Looking at more questions. So this is from Elizabeth. How do we train at home for buried hides? So again, it's an inaccessible hide. So the frequency of inaccessible hides should be very, very small. And like I said before as well, I've sent many dogs to AKC trials where they've done buried hides, and with no training or very little training on buried, they've aced it. Okay, the problem, if they failed the buried hide, it had nothing to do with it being buried. Like one of my students went and failed the buried hide search recently. Why? Well, because it was on grass and because it was raining. So they hadn't practiced enough on grass and in the rain. You can't blame the buried for that, right? So in my opinion, the best way to train at home for buried hides is to set single, paired, accessible hides. And by accessible, it's important that I mean that the dog could put its nose on it, but I don't mean necessarily that it's easy for the dog to put its nose on it. I think you should make it hard for the dog to get to the source. Make them work, for sure. Put obstacles in their way, but then expect them to source it. And if they do that, they'll have no problem with buried. Now, okay, so you understand all of that, check, I agree, but I still want to expose my dog to buried. So first thing I should say for you is we're going to do it in class on Tuesday. So don't run off and do it too quickly because we're going to do it in class. But the way a lot of people have this imagination where, okay, you've got a box of sand. You start with the odor on top and progressively bury it deeper and deeper. That's not the way I do it. The way I do it is I use substances that I can bury the hide deep in right from the get-go, but there's enough airflow between that the odor can escape right from the beginning. So for instance, I'll use big rocks, like about this big, like beach rock. And I'll put the odor at the bottom and I'll fill it up, good, 6 inches. But it's rocks, it's big rocks, so there's lots of airflow. So the dog can easily scent it. And then I'll progressively make the substances smaller and smaller, so make them river rock, and then pebbles, and then gravel, and then sand. And I think that's a better way of exposing the dog to buried hide problems rather than progressively burying deeper and deeper. So I hope that makes sense. Hope that answers. So I see Linda's question here, what to do when you can't read your dog at a trial. And I want you to clarify that question before I ask it. Do you mean that your dog is getting to odor, and like if you got the video, you can see when the dog gets to odor, but you're unable to read it in the actual trial setting? And if it was not a trial, like maybe you do the same search and training, you're able to read it, but at a trial you're not? Or do you mean that when you get to a trial, your dog's behavior in general, not just at the hide, but searching in general, is significantly different than normal? So clarify that for me, and then I'll try to answer that question. So very similar question to what I had before. This is from Elizabeth. When the dog is super excited at the staging area, how much should you contain that exuberance, or just let her get amped up for the hide? This is another question where I would say it depends on the dog and the environment. So is it an element trial? Is it an elite division trial? Is it a 3-day trial where you need your dog's energy over the course of 3 days? With my dog, Lumi, I need every ounce of energy. So I don't want her exuberant in the staging area. So I ask her to lie down and just settle into a down while we're in staging areas. I don't want her wasting energy, kind of searching or jumping or doing tricks or things like that. Now, some of you may have dogs where energy is not an issue, and maybe it's an element trial where it's only half a day, and so you've got energy to spare. Let them amp up. Absolutely. It might actually help you. Having a dog that's amped maybe make them go faster, right? But understand, you trade speed for stamina, right? So the faster you ask the dog to go, the quicker the dog will drain their energy. The slower a dog goes, the longer they'll have energy for throughout a long trial day. So this goes back to my rant that I just posted. What's your goal? Is your goal to have a super fast time now, or is your goal to last the whole trial day? As soon as you figured out what your goal is, you've answered your own question. Okay. Let's see. I think I'm almost out of questions. Okay. So I don't know whether Linda heard that I wanted her to refine her question. So I'll do my best to answer. Maybe I'll just answer both, because maybe it was both. So let's see. Here she did answer. Dove was more tentative at the trial. I could not even recognize that she was searching, though I could tell when she got to odor in a few searches. Okay. There are 3 parts of the search. Hunting, where the dog doesn't know if there's odor in the search. The dog is going through the search area. The source of the odor. Part of the search is the indication. In general, hang on, we'll try to reconnect. Okay, it looks like I'm reconnecting. Give me a heart on my post or a thumbs up if you can hear me. I can't tell if I'm reconnected or not. Okay, I guess I am reconnected. It says I'm reconnecting on YouTube, but I'll go ahead and try to continue. So just so you guys know, I have this joke with Natalie. Natalie just came home from where she was. The joke is that when Natalie comes in, it's working. Well, more evidence, right? And I swear, I'll be sitting there watching TV and it streams through Hulu, and Natalie will walk in the room and the TV will just stop. I'm sure it's just a coincidence, but it is unusual. Maybe Natalie will come in and say hi to people in a second. The cat sure wants her to say hi. Okay, so I was saying there, and I'll answer Ingrid real quick. Yes, this will be available later as soon as we're done. I'm sure it'll upload to YouTube. So 3 parts of the search: hunting, sourcing, and then indication. In general, people tend to
Hi guys.
Emphasize too much indication. Oh, and if you have questions for Natalie, feel free to ask Natalie questions too. But yeah, so people tend to focus too much on the indication, and whereas I think the dog spends the majority of their time hunting and sourcing, so those problems should be focused on the most. So the best way to fix that is to train in as many new locations as possible, which I know you do. So keep at it. But if I go to an environment and I can see my dog is not working like they normally work, then I might go to the point where I say, this is a socialization search. I'm just going to let my dog investigate the environment. That's one option. Let them investigate freely, and at some point they will, maybe they'll catch it, maybe they won't. But I know when I leave, I've given my dog the most opportunity to learn from the environment. The other option is I will go back to the start line, or I'll take my dog somewhere where I know there is an odor. I don't want to do this near odor. And I'll stop my dog. I'll engage with my dog. I'll get a treat out. I'll jazz them up. I might even give them a treat. I might tease them and not let them have the treat. I want the dog to say, I want that treat. I want that treat. And when my dog says, I want the treat, say, then you know what to do. Go find it. Right? That can really help with some dogs. Now, if you haven't done that in training, some dogs will just go, I want the treat, and they'll be glued to you. I do it a lot in training so that they know when I tease them with a treat, they start searching. It's a cue to search. So if you've stopped training with treats in your hand, I might try that. I might tease her through the search. That might be a good way to bridge that gap. The fact that you can tell that when she goes into odor in an environment where she's distracted shows that she has some decent odor obedience, and that the environmental question is much stronger. The more you can counteract the environment being an issue, the better. So, how do we train at home? This is from Liz. How do we train at home with obstacles? If I can't get in there to reward right away, or it takes a moment to get her to reward, or can't fit into a reward. Point of training, yeah. Well, Natalie says, just throw the treat, which is correct. Yeah, absolutely, you could do that. But if you are at the point where your dog is wedging themselves into that tight of an area, take your time, get there when you get there, because your dog, you've built enough drive that the dog will wait, and you don't have to worry about getting in there quick anymore. That is an issue for the past, right? For a different handler, you can just take your time, just praise the dog, and get there and reward on a treat. Yeah, I throw the treat all the time in training. So,
just don't do it at a trial.
Yeah. Natalie says just don't do it at a trial, which is absolutely correct. I've never seen someone intentionally throw a treat at a trial yet, but it's bound to happen. Someone's going to train a lot with throwing treats and do it at a trial. Definitely don't do that. You will get a food fault. Let me see if I have any more questions. I think that might be everything. We're almost at an hour. While I'm looking at questions, I want to thank my patrons for being such awesome patrons and supporting us doing this. Thank you so much for making this doable for us. We really appreciate it. I'm thinking about doing this kind of a live stream once a month or every other month. So I hope that, if you guys enjoyed it or like the format or want a different format, let me know. I also think that occasionally I might be able to get a guest on to answer questions with me and to discuss it with me. So other nosework trainers might be willing to sit in on this, and that could be really great. So if there's someone you think I should have a conversation with, let me know, and I'll try to get them on. I'm going to try to convince Leah Gangelhoff to do one of these with me, and I'm putting a lot of pressure on her. She doesn't even. She probably won't ever see this, but now you guys can all tell. Leah, Michael said he's going to put you on his show. Anyways, before I leave, I want to show you my cool shirt. You won't be able to hear me because I'm leaving the mic, but lady in Maryland makes these nosework shirts. Awesome, cool design. She gave me this one when I was at a workshop for her. Can they see it?
Yeah. So it says Virgin Rescue.
That's one of her newest designs. Her business name is Wiggle Butts. You can look her up. She makes some great shirts. They have really cute designs, and you should definitely look them up if you can. And I think we'll be maybe offering some of her shirts as prizes or something at some point in the future. So yeah, thank you guys so much for joining in on this, and I hope you liked it. I'm looking forward to here when Natalie came home.